Hey everyone, ELD here, and I've often lobbied for Mana Drain being unbanned in Legacy, and often I say, I don't even think it would be a top 10 counterspell in the format. Well, I was pressed on that recently and had to actually put in a little effort to come up with a list of 10 counterspells that I think are clearly better. Keep in mind, in Vintage, Mana Drain sees virtually zero play, maybe as a one of in like less than 1% of decks. First off, cards that are not going to be on the list, talking about things like Stifle that don't counter spells, or Thoughtseize that plays a very similar role. Also, permanents like Chalice of the Void and Counterbalance that your opponent sees on board and can potentially play around are not going to be included. So, without further ado, number one, you know what it has to be, the very best that there is, Force of Will, undisputed. This is, in a lot of ways, the glue that holds the format together, and it is the best counterspell of all time, seeing play in over half of all decks. Up next, this one keeps tempo decks as a viable option. Daze, incredibly strong, and of course, much better than Mana Drain. I think this is we're not even in close to debate territory. All of these cards so far are so much better. This next one, Force of Negation, 13.6% of main decks, but actually in a ton of sideboards, and that's because it really flips the equation on its head. If you're playing against a deck that's jamming all in, game one, you have less than a 50-50 chance of having Force of Will if you only play 4 forces, but if you bring in a couple of Force negations, now you're going to have a better than 50-50 chance, turning one of their greatest strengths into a liability where percentage-wise you're more likely to stop them than they are to be able to win after going all in. Not yet. Number 4 is Spell Pierce. This card delays the game. If you want to run full headlong into my control deck, Leroy Jenkins style, man, does it hurt to get shut down by Spell Pierce. This is so versatile, and I'll tell you, I've seen players totally demoralized when they try and jam a card like Minskin Boo and don't even get the trade of a Force of Will. Just for a single mana, brushing aside your spell is very, very punishing, especially if you could have potentially waited a little while longer and resolved that spell. Number 5, this one might surprise some of you. Shutting everything down, Veil of Summer. So this does actually counter spells on the stack. I think with the kind of conditions that a lot of counter spells have, only being able to target certain types of cards, I actually think this qualifies as a counter spell. If we're having a counter battle and I have Veil of Summer on my side and you're playing clunky stuff like Mana Drain, it is very obvious how that is going to go consistently in the favor of the cheaper, more efficient card that, also draws a card, which is absolutely insane, like a 1-mana Cryptic Command. Number 6. This is actually a 2-for-1, shutting down blue cards in Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast. Love Reb, as it's actually, the alpha printing is printed as an instant incorrectly. It was an interrupt back in the day. One of my favorite misprints there, but this is incredibly strong, not only because it can counter blue spells on the stack, and most counter spells are blue, but it also, if they slip something by that's a blue permanent, you can blow it up as well. So Jace the Mind Sculptor, Teferi, Narset, any type of blue permanent on board, these can potentially mop that up as well. Most notably, Murktide Regent. That's a card that for sure you do not want to be dead to and draw a counter spell after they've resolved their bomb. This one, you're actually happy to see. And again, piling on blue cards. This one in only 2.7% of decks. Not that much more in sideboards either, but Mystical Dispute. I think this is where you can start talking about Mana Drain reasonably. I think this card is much, much better than Mana Drain at only 1 blue to counter blue spells. I actually sideboard this card to combat the War of the Sparks Planeswalkers. Narset and Teferi can be real problems for some decks that I've run, and Mystical Dispute I found is one of the cleaner answers to those Planeswalkers. If they hit and they draw a card, answering them after the fact feels terrible. Number 8 in 2.1% of decks is Fluster Storm, and this emphatically says no. Of course, it can counter storm spells, which is primarily why it's so popular, but if you're in a situation where you really have to stop some game-breaking sorcery, doesn't matter how many counterspells your opponent has in hand, if you have Fluster Storm and they don't, it is going to be virtually impossible to counter all of the copies of Fluster Storm after a key turn. Number 9. This one, 2.5% of decks actually cost 2 mana. You may have noticed that everything else so far is 1 mana or castable for free. This is a 2 mana card, and this is a real point of contention. Like, is this card better than Mana Drain? I think it probably is. This has the ability to actually answer creatures after the fact, and I think that's what will give it the nod. Just the higher utility. Mana Drain, of course, getting the mana from it when it goes well, sure, that's great, but I think it's going to be too big of an ask, and Drown on the Lock, I think, as a 2 mana spell, actually has that utility to be able to answer a creature or win a counter battle. And number 10, this one doesn't see much main deck play, but in 7.4% of sideboards is Mindbreak Trap. This, again, I think is a stronger card than Mana Drain, though it's available to all colors. We actually see red decks or mono white decks even running a card like Mindbreak Trap just to try and keep those pesky counter combo decks in check. And that's just 10 cards right there. Technically 11. We had Reb and Pyroblast. Let me know where you think Mana Drain would fit in. Keep in mind, there are a bunch of other cards, Pact and Negation and, Minor Misstep, Spell Snare, Misdirection. There's just so many counters in Legacy. I think Mana Drain would be a fun tool to experiment with. I think people would be excited to try it out. We take a look at cEDH, and it's not dominating there by any stretch, but it does occasionally see some play. I think they need to stop being cowards, unrestrict the card, or at least let us try it in Magic Online. Do it for a month or two. Just do a separate format where Mana Drain is unbanned and see if it becomes a massive problem. I don't think there's any chance that's going to happen. I think it would be better off to bring it in and kind of complete that full circle of the format. Originally, Mana Drain was kind of a big reason why the lists were managed the way they were, because it was so powerful, and then eventually they split off to make Legacy its own format, mostly so Mana Drain wouldn't be part of it and wouldn't dominate. But times have changed. It is time. Let's see that card in Legacy.